Millionaire comes home early to his ranch and almost faints after seeing his daughters with the maid. Alejandro Ferrer stopped his car in the middle of the dirt road leading into the ranch, nearly 3 hours ahead of schedule, as if even he did not understand why he had arrived here at this hour. One hand still rested on the door of the black armored SUV, a cold, heavy block of metal that looked completely out of place amid the rural scenery of straw-covered ground, dry grass, and the familiar damp earth scent of the outskirts. According to the plan, Alejandro should have been sitting in a glass-walled boardroom in the city center at this moment, discussing figures and contracts worth hundreds of millions. But a meeting canceled without warning had sent him back here earlier than expected, back to the ranch he had never known whether to call home or merely a temporary refuge for his own grief. And then, the very instant the wheels came to a full stop, he heard a sound that froze his entire body. Laughter, not the wind, not birds, not a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. It was the clear, bright laughter of children bursting out without restraint, rippling through the quiet afternoon like waves that could not be held back. Alejandro's heart slammed against his chest, slipping into a frighteningly uneven rhythm. The sound did not merely reach his ears. It struck straight into his chest, awakening something he had tried to bury for months. He stood motionless, afraid that a single step or a deeper breath might cause that laughter to vanish like a cruel trick of his own mind. 6 months. 6 months since the fateful storm stole his wife, this vast ranch had existed in only one state: silence. A silence carefully preserved, fiercely guarded, as though any sound might shatter the fragile order Alejandro had built just to survive. His 4 quadruplet daughters, Isabella, Camila, Renata, and Luna, had not spoken a single word since the day their mother passed away. The doctors called it post-traumatic mutism, a psychological response that could be understood. Alejandro did not use medical terms. In his mind, it was the price of tragedy, a debt the entire family was forced to carry in silence. And yet now, in this dust-lit afternoon, that very pain was laughing. Alejandro shut the car door harder than necessary, the metallic sound echoing sharply. He adjusted the knot of his Italian silk tie out of habit, even though no one was watching, then lowered his gaze to the thin layer of dust beginning to cling to his perfectly polished leather shoes. A small detail, but enough to make him frown, as if that tiny disorder had trespassed upon his absolute world of control. The laughter continued, not just one voice, but many weaving together, overlapping, chaotic, and strangely so beautiful it made Alejandro's throat tighten. He began to walk, almost pulled toward the sound, crossing empty stalls, letting the scent of dry hay and aged wood swirl around him, his eyes fixed only on the area behind the ranch, a place he rarely gave any thought to: the chicken coop. When Alejandro rounded the corner of the storage shed, the sight before him made him freeze, as though the entire world had just halted for a single breath. There was Lucia Moreno, the nanny Alejandro had hired only a few months earlier to care for his 4 children. She was kneeling on the ground, both knees smeared with mud, her hands covered in bright yellow rubber gloves, a color far too vivid compared to the muted, controlled palette Alejandro was accustomed to. Her blue uniform was still the one he had personally approved, but the white apron in front was now streaked and splattered with mud. Around her stood 4 small figures: Isabella, Camila, Renata, and Luna. The 4 daughters Alejandro had seen sitting properly at the breakfast table that very morning, wearing neatly pressed light-colored dresses, their hair carefully brushed and tied with bows, now looked entirely different. Their designer dresses were no longer recognizable in their original shades, buried beneath mud and fine dust. Their bows hung loose, slipping halfway out. Their white socks were gone, revealing small bare feet coated in grime, feet that would not stop moving. His daughters were running. They were circling Lucia, arms lifted high, clumsily copying her movements, laughing freely, chasing after chickens that flapped in panic and scattered in every direction. Their laughter had no rhythm, no restraint, spilling out wildly and so genuinely that Alejandro's throat locked tight. He had not heard that sound in 6 months. Alejandro's heart pounded unevenly. His hands, always spotless and meticulously cared for, curled unconsciously into fists. Inside his mind, thoughts collided in chaos. Relief at seeing his daughters alive with energy, pain at realizing he had not been able to give them that, and a dark, simmering anger rising without warning. He took a few steps closer, his polished leather shoes sinking into the soft mud, an unpleasant sensation crawling up his spine. The scent of damp earth, chicken feathers, and decaying grass blended in the air, the complete opposite of the disinfectant and waxed polish of his home. One of the 4 girls, Alejandro could not tell whether it was Isabella or Camila, tripped over a tree root protruding from the ground and fell face first into the mud. Under any other circumstances, such a fall would have triggered panicked tears, the kind of chaos Alejandro always tried to prevent. But this time, it did not. The little girl pushed herself up, her face smeared with dirt, glanced at Lucia for a second, and then burst into even louder laughter, scooping up a handful of mud and tossing it into the air like confetti. The laughter of the other 3 immediately joined in, high-pitched and unrestrained. Alejandro felt as though the ground beneath his feet tilted. For months he had hired the best specialists, bought the most expensive equipment, and designed the most perfect environment to shield his children from pain. And none of it had worked. Yet now, with nothing more than mud, chickens, and a young woman who followed none of his rules, a miracle was unfolding. A light breeze passed through, rustling the leaves and lifting the scent of damp soil into the air. Lucia spun around, completely unaware of Alejandro's presence, then bent down and gently caught a frantic chicken with both hands. She lifted the bird for the 4 girls to see, letting them touch its soft feathers, their small mud-coated hands trembling with excitement. The 4 little girls gathered closely around her, focused, absorbed, as if the entire world had narrowed to that single moment. Alejandro clenched his jaw. "What the hell is going on here?" Alejandro's voice rang out low, heavy, and ice-cold. It did not need to be raised to crush the air around it. The sound fell like shattering glass onto the ground, harsh and merciless, ripping through an afternoon that had been glittering with laughter. The effect was immediate. The laughter was cut off so abruptly that its echo seemed to hang suspended in the air, stranded and without a place to land. The chickens burst into frantic flapping and scattered toward the coop. Lucia spun around, her eyes widening in shock, the smile on her lips freezing before it could fade. But what made Alejandro falter for a split heartbeat was not the chaos of the chickens nor Lucia's stunned expression. It was his daughter's reaction. Isabella, Camila, Renata, and Luna went pale all at once. The rosy glow of joy drained from their small faces with frightening speed, replaced by pure terror. The eyes that had just been shining with excitement now widened in panic, like young animals that had just heard a predator. They did not run toward Alejandro, not a single one. Instead, all 4 instinctively stepped backward, stumbling over one another in fear, then hurried to hide behind Lucia. Their small, mud-smeared hands clutched tightly at the hem of her blue uniform, pressing their faces into her dirty apron, trembling violently, as if that were the only shelter left in the world. That moment struck Alejandro Ferrer like a blow without warning. His chest tightened. Part of him wanted to deny what he had just seen, to believe it was only a passing reflex. But the image was too clear, too merciless to reject. His daughters, his own blood, were seeking protection not from their father, but from a girl he had hired less than a month ago. A cold fire flared inside Alejandro's chest. He stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the mud without him noticing. His gaze locked onto Lucia, as if she were the source of all this disorder. "I asked you a question, Ms. Moreno," he said, his voice lowering into something dangerous, each word weighted like lead. "What do you call this scene?" Lucia felt the small, trembling bodies behind her. Her heart pounded as if it would break through her ribs, but she did not step back. Her hands moved to rest on the heads of the 4 children, an unconscious yet fiercely protective gesture. "Mr. Ferrer," she began, her voice shaking but unbroken. "We were just playing. The girls—" "Playing?" Alejandro cut in, raising a hand to point sharply at the mud-smeared dresses. "You call this playing? Look at them, filthy, full of bacteria, out of control. Do you have any idea how much those outfits cost?" Lucia swallowed hard. She knew who stood before her, knew Alejandro Ferrer's reputation, knew that one more word could cost her the job she desperately needed. But then she heard a soft, strangled whimper from behind her, a sound of fear trapped in a young throat, and it extinguished her own fear. "Clothes can be washed, sir," Lucia said, lifting her head and meeting Alejandro's eyes. "But grief cannot. Today—" Today they laughed, for the first time. Her words were salt rubbed into a wound that had not yet closed inside Alejandro. He hated that she was right. Hated even more that an employee dared to stand on his land and teach him how to be a father. His reason screamed that this was an intolerable challenge to his authority. "You have no right to speak to me about my children," Alejandro growled. "You are here to follow rules. I was perfectly clear. No mud, no risks, no chaos. And you ignored all of it." He stepped closer, invading Lucia's space. The 4 children shrank together, releasing a collective, panicked whimper that made Lucia tighten her grip around them. "Come out of there," Alejandro ordered, not looking at the girls, his eyes still locked onto Lucia. "Come to your father, now." No one moved. 4 small bodies clung tighter to Lucia, as if she were the final wall between them and terror. That silence, that wordless defiance, made Alejandro lose control. "I said, come here!" The shout exploded out of him, raw and desperate. Night fell over the Ferrer ranch like a heavy blanket, soaked with dampness. After the iron gate closed behind Lucia, Alejandro Ferrer returned to the main house with his children, carrying the cold sense of victory of a man who had just re-established order. Everything was back in its place. No mud, no laughter, no surprises. He told himself he had done what needed to be done. The 4 girls were taken straight to the bathroom. Alejandro personally turned on the hot water, the familiar sterile scent of imported soap filling the air. He scrubbed their delicate skin harder than necessary, as if he were not only washing away mud, but trying to erase the memory of the afternoon itself. The water in the tub quickly turned a pale brown. Seeing it, Alejandro felt a twisted sense of confirmation. He had been right. That place truly was filthy. After being dressed in identical white silk pajamas, their hair smoothed and brushed, the 4 girls sat at the dinner table like small shadows. Alejandro tried to speak a few words, tried to act calm, but the silence that answered him was heavier than ever. There was no clink of spoons against bowls, no responsive glances. Only 4 small faces lowered, as if their souls had been left somewhere out there. The storm began when the clock passed 9 o'clock. The wind rose, pounding dull blows against the glass windows. Thunder rolled in the distance, dragging old memories up from the depths of Alejandro's mind. The night Elena died had also carried a storm like this. A crack of thunder tore through the dense black sky like a belated warning. Alejandro Ferrer jolted awake and hurried toward the children's room. As he crossed the great hall, a bolt of lightning ripped open the sky, cold white light flooding through the tall glass windows, illuminating every corner of the house. A chilling premonition slid down his spine as he stood before the door to his daughter's bedroom. The room was empty. 4 small beds, their sheets perfectly smooth, as if no one had ever lain on them. Stuffed animals were neatly lined up on the shelves. No rumpled blankets, no trace of sleep. Only the window stood wide open, the curtains snapping wildly in the wind. A thunderclap exploded directly above the roof. Alejandro rushed to the window, leaning out into the rain that had begun to fall heavily. Under the flickering lightning, he saw something that froze his blood. A strip of white fabric. A small piece of silk caught in the vines beneath the window. Part of a pajama set. "No, this can't be," Alejandro whispered, his voice breaking. The 4 children had climbed out. They were gone. Panic erupted violently, tearing apart every last layer of control Alejandro still possessed. He spun around and ran out of the room, grabbing his radio as he ran, his voice cracking. "Ramiro! Everyone! Get up here now! My children, they're not in their room." Rain poured down like a waterfall. Wind howled around the house, turning the perfectly manicured garden into a dark and dangerous maze. Alejandro burst outside, no raincoat, no flashlight, driven only by raw fear. He ran across the backyard, past the chicken coop, calling each child's name in vain. And then he noticed something. Footprints. In the soft mud, small footprints appeared in chaotic patterns. They were not heading toward the chicken coop. They were moving in the opposite direction, toward the gate, toward the dirt road leading out of the ranch. "Lucia!" Alejandro gasped, the name slipping out like a painful confession. They were looking for her. A violent gust nearly knocked him off his feet. Gritting his teeth, Alejandro ran after the footprints as the rain slowly washed them away. Horrifying images flooded his mind. The nearby highway with its overnight freight trucks, the stream west of the ranch, where water could rise within minutes. "No, please don't," he muttered, slipping and stumbling through the mud. Another lightning bolt lit up the road ahead, and Alejandro froze. The footprints suddenly veered. They left the main road and plunged into a wild grassy field leading down a low slope toward the dry creek he had once been warned would become dangerous in heavy rain. The sound of water. At first faint, then growing louder, rushing, violent water, mixing with rain and thunder. Alejandro's throat went dry. "Not that way! Please! Not that way!" He ran madly through the brush, thorns tearing his skin without him feeling pain. Only one fear consumed his mind. He might lose his children, not to an accident, but to his own decisions. As he slid down near the edge of the slope, a lightning flash tore open the sky. And in that instant, Alejandro saw them. 4 tiny figures, huddled on a small mound of earth amid rapidly rising water, their white pajamas smeared with mud, arms locked tightly around one another. The water had already reached their ankles, carrying branches and debris. "My girls!" Alejandro shouted, his voice ripping through the storm. 4 small heads lifted. In the lightning's glare, he saw their pale faces, trembling lips. There was no reply, only terrified, hopeless eyes. The water kept rising, and Alejandro Ferrer realized too late that this was no longer a search. It was a race against death. Alejandro Ferrer stood frozen on the slippery bank, his breath ragged, his heart pounding so violently it felt as though his chest might burst apart. The water below was no longer the gentle stream he had once seen in the dry reports of the ranch manager. It had transformed into a murky, surging current, carrying branches, debris, and the blind power of the storm. In the middle of that torrent, on a small mound of earth being eroded second by second, were his 4 daughters. Isabella, Camila, Renata, and Luna clung tightly to one another, their tiny bodies trembling from cold and terror. The water had already reached their calves. Each time a small wave swept over them, the mound collapsed a little more, as if time itself were crushing their chance to survive. "Don't be afraid!" Alejandro shouted, his voice breaking through the rain and wind. "Dad is here!" But he did not believe his own words. The distance from the bank to the mound was not far, only a few meters, yet it was a deadly few meters. The slope was slick with mud, offering no secure footing. If he slipped, the current would swallow him in an instant, and if he were swept away, his daughters would be left with no one. Alejandro dropped to his knees, his trembling hands braced against the soaked ground. His reason, the same mind that had once governed $100 million deals, screamed cold calculations. Survival probability low, risk extreme, no safe options. But for the first time in his life, he could not rely on reason. "Dad!" A hoarse, broken call pierced the storm. It was Luna's voice, and in that instant he understood that if he did not step down, it was not only their lives at risk, it was the final thread tying them to him, a father they were still desperate enough to call. "I'm coming," Alejandro said, not shouting now, but speaking slowly and clearly, as if each word were a vow. "Listen to me. Hold on to each other. Do not move." He tore off his jacket and threw it aside, pulled off his shoes, even removed his expensive watch, the symbol of time he had once believed he controlled, and let it fall into the mud without regret. Alejandro began his descent. The mud was slick. His feet sank, slid. He grabbed at roots, his fingernails digging into the soil, burning with pain. But he did not let go. Every step was a struggle between life and death. The water touched his legs, icy, violent, like thousands of needles piercing his skin. "Dad!" Isabella reached out, tears mixing with rain. "I'm here!" Alejandro roared, stretching one hand toward her while the other clung desperately to a rock jutting from the water. "Don't let go of each other! Listen to me!" The current was stronger than he had imagined. It pulled, twisted, wrapped around his legs as if trying to drag everything down. Alejandro felt his balance slipping away. One sliding step, a sharp gasp. His heart nearly stopped when his foot lost contact with the ground. In that moment, he thought of Elena, of the final afternoon he had missed because of a meeting, of his wife's smile in the photograph on his desk, the woman who had once told him their children did not need a fortress, but needed an embrace. "I'm sorry," Alejandro whispered, not knowing to whom. "Please, give me a chance." He reached out, pouring all his remaining strength into the movement, and his hand closed around Isabella's small one. The sensation, trembling flesh, icy but alive, jolted Alejandro awake. He tightened his grip, pulled her closer, and used his own body to shield all four girls from the current. But just as he thought he had secured them, a large log swept by the flood slammed violently into the mound. The ground collapsed. A soundless scream tore through the storm. Alejandro managed only to wrap his arms around his daughters as the raging water ripped them away, dragging them down into the freezing darkness and the furious spiral of the swollen stream. Then, amid the roar of the water, another sound cut through. "Alejandro!" He was not sure whether it was a hallucination. "Alejandro, look at me." Lucia Moreno. She stood on the opposite bank of the stream, where the land was lower but less steep, her hair plastered to her face by rain, clothes soaked through, bare hands trembling, yet her eyes burned with fierce determination. She should not have been there. She had been dismissed. The iron gate had slammed shut behind her. And yet she had stayed. Lucia charged down the bank without hesitation, without calculation. Mud splashed, thorns tore at her skin, but she did not slow. In that moment, she was no longer an employee, no longer someone humiliated and expelled. She was simply the only one still clear-headed enough to act. "Hold on to them!" she shouted. "Don't let go!" The current hurled Alejandro and the four children toward another small mound of earth, more fragile, but solid enough to stop them briefly. Alejandro coughed violently, struggling to lift his head, and saw Lucia wading into the water from the opposite side. "Lucia," he gasped, "don't. It's too dangerous." She did not answer. Lucia bent down and grabbed a large branch jammed in the current, hauling it toward herself with the full weight of her body. The water fought back violently, like a wild beast refusing to release its prey. She clenched her teeth, veins standing out, both arms shaking. "Alejandro!" she yelled. "I need you to stand firm!" "I'll bring the children over first." "No," he shouted back. "You'll be swept away." Lucia lifted her head, her gaze cutting through rain and darkness. There was no fear in her eyes, only a single command. "Listen to me!" She hurled the end of the branch toward Alejandro. He reached out in the last second, his hand slipping in mud and water, and finally caught it. The branch stretched between the two banks, fragile, but their only chance. "Send Luna first," Lucia shouted. Alejandro hesitated for a heartbeat, then obeyed. He lifted his youngest daughter, his hands trembling, her lips bluish with cold. "I'm here," he whispered, then entrusted her to the water, to Lucia. Lucia snatched Luna, nearly losing her balance, but dropped to her knees in the mud, using her own body as an anchor. She pulled the little girl up onto the bank, held her tight, then turned back. Camila, Renata, Isabella. One by one, each small body was passed across. Each time the current roared more furiously, as if enraged at being denied its victims. When Isabella, the last, left Alejandro's arms, the water rose to his chest. The branch trembled violently. "Now you!" Lucia shouted. Alejandro shook his head. "If I let go, the branch will—" "You're not allowed to die!" Lucia screamed, her voice breaking. "Your children need you." Those words struck Alejandro harder than the current itself. He released the crumbling mound and let the water push him toward the branch. In that suspended instant, he slipped, his body vanishing beneath the surface. Lucia lunged forward. She grabbed the collar of his shirt, hauling him back with every ounce of strength she had, just as the security staff finally appeared behind her, throwing ropes into the water. Multiple hands pulled together. Alejandro was dragged onto the bank in a fit of violent coughing, his lungs burning as if they might burst. He lay face down in the mud, unable to move. The four girls burst into sobs, this time with sound, throwing themselves into Lucia's arms and then into Alejandro's, crying uncontrollably. The rain began to soften. Amid the mud, tears, and ragged breathing, Alejandro lifted his head and looked at Lucia. She sat there, clothes torn, hands scraped raw, holding his children as though nothing else in the world existed. The rain withdrew slowly, as if the sky itself were exhausted after its long rage. Only heavy droplets remained, falling from leaves, thudding softly onto the muddy ground, cold seeping deep into flesh and bone. Alejandro Ferrer sat collapsed beneath an old tree, his back pressed against its rough trunk, his entire body trembling, not knowing whether from cold or from the aftershocks of the terror he had just survived. The four children still clung tightly to Lucia. They wrapped around her with everything small yet fierce they had. Thin arms, shaking shoulders, ragged breathing mixed with uncontrolled sobs. This time they were not silent. Their crying broke free, shattered, chaotic, yet alive, the very sound Alejandro had once longed to hear. And now it made his heart ache. Lucia sat on the ground, her back curved protectively around the four tiny bodies. Her clothes were torn in places, her hands and legs scraped raw, her hair streaked with mud, yet every movement she made was slow and steady. She rubbed each child's back, whispering wordless comforts, as though language itself no longer mattered. Alejandro watched the scene and did not dare move closer. For years, he had always been the one who stood tall, gave orders, controlled everything, never lowering himself beneath anyone. But now, even standing was a challenge. His body was utterly drained, yet heavier still was the collapse he felt inside. One of the 4 children, Isabella, slowly loosened her hold on Lucia. She turned her still tearful eyes toward Alejandro. That look carried no blame, no resentment, only a fragile uncertainty, as if she were deciding whether the man before her was still a danger. Alejandro held his breath. He did not call her name. He did not command. He did not step forward. For the first time, he waited. Isabella took one small step forward, then stopped. She lifted her hand and gently touched Alejandro's mud-caked arm, a trembling, hesitant touch, yet undeniably real. In that moment, something inside Alejandro broke completely. He bent forward, both hands clutching his head, his breath breaking into harsh, choking sobs. Not neat tears, not controlled grief, but the collapse of a man who had tried for too long to feel nothing at all. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely, shattered. "I'm sorry for not listening, for frightening you." Isabella did not fully understand the words, but she understood the tone. She turned back and drew her 3 sisters closer. The 4 children stood before Alejandro, muddy, soaked, but their eyes were no longer filled only with terror. Lucia slowly rose. She placed a hand on Alejandro's shoulder, not in blame, not in forgiveness, but as a temporary anchor. Alejandro lifted his eyes to her. In them there was no longer power, no distance, only raw vulnerability. I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I thought if everything were clean, controlled, then the pain would disappear. But I only made everything worse." Lucia did not answer immediately. She looked at the 4 children, then back at Alejandro. "You don't need to know everything," she said softly. "Just be there. This time, truly, be there." Alejandro nodded slowly, as if each nod were a new promise, imperfect, uncertain, yet sincere. Flashlights approached in the distance. Security staff moved closer, bringing dry coats and warm blankets. The night was still cold, the ground still muddy. But something had changed forever. The ice giant had fallen, and amid its ruins a father, for the first time, was learning how to kneel, so that he could rise together with his children. Dawn was near. After the storm, the air carried a strange scent, the smell of washed earth, shattered leaves, of a world that had just survived disaster. Alejandro Ferrer sat in the grand living room of the main house, wrapped in a thick sweater, both hands around a cup of hot tea, yet still trembling slightly. For the first time in many years, that trembling did not shame him. The 4 children were curled together on the large rug in front of the fireplace, wrapped in a single heavy blanket. Lucia sat leaning against the sofa, her legs drawn up, one hand resting on Isabella's shoulder, the other on Luna's back. "Lucia." His voice was hoarse, no longer carrying its familiar sharp edge. "May I speak with you?" Alejandro stepped forward, then stopped. He did not dare sit higher than her. Finally, he knelt, on the floor, at the same level as Lucia and the 4 children. The gesture silenced everyone in the room. "I'm sorry," he said. "No excuses, no explanations. For hurting you, for using my power to hide my fear, and for making my children," his voice faltered, "afraid of their own father." Isabella looked up at him. Her eyes were no longer panicked, but they were still cautious. Alejandro returned her gaze, without urgency, without demands. "I don't know how to be a father," he continued, his voice trembling. "I thought if I kept everything clean, quiet by the rules, I could keep them safe, but I was wrong. I turned this house into a place without life." No one interrupted him. "You came back," Alejandro said, turning to Lucia. "After everything I did, you didn't owe me that, and yet you still came back, to save my children." He bowed his head deeply. "No apology is enough," he said. "But if you still can, I ask you to stay, not as an employee, but as the person my children trust, and as the person I need to learn to listen to." Lucia closed her eyes for a brief moment. She did not answer right away. She looked at the four girls. They were watching her, waiting, hopeful, afraid. Finally, she opened her eyes. "I don't need you to be perfect," Lucia said softly. "I only need you to be real, with your children." Alejandro nodded. "I promise." It was not a grand promise, but it was real. The fireplace crackled softly. Outside, the sky began to pale into light gray. The first light of dawn slipped through the tall glass windows, touching tired, mud-streaked faces. But alive. Luna stirred, nuzzled her head into Lucia's hand, and then, very softly, very weakly, she whispered, "Stay." Lucia bent down and kissed the little girl's damp hair. "Yes, I'll stay." Alejandro closed his eyes. A warm tear overflowed and rolled down his cheek. This time he did not wipe it away. The dawn rose slowly, as if unwilling to startle anyone. Its light filled the once cold house with a gentle golden hue, without judgment, without demands. A new day began. 6 months did not create a miracle. They did not erase the memory of the storm, did not make the scars disappear, and did not turn Alejandro Ferrer into a different man overnight. But 6 months were enough for a house to learn how to breathe again. Mornings at the Ferrer Ranch now begin with sound, not the hushed footsteps of servants, not doors closing so softly they almost did not exist, but the patter of bare feet on wooden hallways, giggles that fail to stay quiet, and sometimes small arguments over who gets the seat by the window. Alejandro stands in the kitchen, a wooden spoon in hand, stirring a pot of oatmeal bubbling gently. He wears an old t-shirt and sweatpants, clothes that 6 months ago he would never have allowed himself to be seen in. A faint white smudge stains his sleeve, unclear whether from flour or yesterday's failed attempt at baking. He does not hurry to wipe it away. "Dad!" Luna shouts from the living room. "Isabella hid my socks." "I didn't hide them," Isabella shoots back immediately. "I just borrowed them." Alejandro smiles. Not a perfect smile, a little tired, but real. "Breakfast first," he calls out. "Then we'll settle it in a civilized way." "What does civilized mean?" Luna asks. Alejandro pauses for a second, then laughs. "It means not throwing pillows." Lucia stands at the kitchen doorway, leaning against the refrigerator, a mug of coffee in hand. She no longer wears a uniform. She is now part of this household. She watches Alejandro without speaking. She has seen him fail many times over the past 6 months. He forgot pickup time once. He lost his temper once when the 4 girls broke an antique vase, then stayed silent all afternoon until he came back to apologize himself. He is still awkward with hugs, still unsure how to respond to sudden tears, still sometimes tempted to disappear into work. But he does not run anymore. After breakfast, Alejandro helps the girls put on their shoes. He bends low, tying Camila's laces, slowly, clumsily, but patiently. Renata sits beside her, deliberately loosening her laces, so Dad has to do it again. Lucia watches the scene, her heart softening in a quiet way. In the afternoon, the 4 children play in the backyard, once a perfectly manicured lawn, now with a corner of bare earth sectioned off, bearing a small wooden sign scrawled by Luna herself. "Messy Zone Allowed." Alejandro stands on the porch, a towel in hand, but does not intervene. When Isabella slips and falls, he steps forward, then stops. Isabella gets up on her own, brushes off the mud, and looks toward him. Alejandro gives a thumbs up. She grins. Lucia steps to stand beside him. "You're learning faster than I thought," she says. Alejandro shakes his head. "No, I'm just learning how to slow down." He watches his children run circles around the tree, shouting, laughing, filthy from head to toe. "I used to think silence was safety," he says quietly. "Now I understand. Silence is the most dangerous thing of all." Lucia does not answer. She simply stands there, with him. "I want to make one thing clear," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to replace anyone." Alejandro nodded. "I know." "I'm not their mother," Lucia continued, "and I don't want to become a shadow that's forced into that role." Alejandro looked at her, his eyes sincere. "You're not replacing, you're staying, and that is already more than enough." Lucia remained silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. They did not need to name their relationship just yet. No grand promises, no pre-written future. They only needed to stay. That night, the whole family slept together again in the living room, not out of fear, but because a new habit had formed. Alejandro lay at the edge of the rug, the 4 girls in the middle, Lucia on the opposite side. Before drifting off, Isabella stirred and turned toward Alejandro. "Dad," she whispered. "Yes?" "Are you still the richest person?" Alejandro smiled in the darkness. He thought for a moment, then answered, "No." Isabella relaxed. "That's good." Alejandro closed his eyes. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. A night bird called. The Farah Ranch, once a cold fortress of power, was now simply a home. Not perfect, not spotless, but full of laughter, muddy footprints, and hearts learning how to trust again. Alejandro Ferrer had lost a part of his old world, but he had found the real one, and this time he did not need to be richer than anyone. He only needed to stay and love enough.